Hey there, I'm going to be giving an overview of all of the Dragonlance books for you. The goal is to show what the different books are, how they relate to each other, and help you figure out what to read next. For newcomers, I'll briefly describe what Dragonlance is all about. The Dragonlance Saga is a series of epic high fantasy novels that take place on the continent of Ansalon, on the world of Krynn. The series began with the Chronicles trilogy released in 1984 by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. It was originally developed as a tie-in to a Dragonlance Dungeons & Dragons world, but the novels quickly became much more popular than the game setting. Major themes include the rise and fall and rise again of the world and its peoples, as well as the constant struggle to find balance between the contests of good and evil. There are elves and dwarves and gods and magic and knights and, of course, dragons. It's a fantastic series and an amazing example of collective imagining. Between 1984 and 2010, about 170 Dragonlance books were published, making this a fairly large work of collaborative storytelling with many events, characters, and histories. The breadth and depth of the series makes it very attractive to some people, and unfortunately it also means I'm definitely going to make a bunch of mistakes. It also results in one of the more common questions regarding this series being, what order should I read the books in, or what should I read next? I hope I'll be able to help you out with this question. The simplest answer is to just go and read all of the core storyline books. There are about a dozen so-called core books, all written by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, that develop the central narrative plot of the series. And while that is good advice, it still leaves like 150 books unaccounted for. So what I'm going to do is go through all the books in the series and show you how they connect together, and gradually build up a map that you can use to tailor your reading list to best fit your individual interests. There are many gems to be found, shining beyond the core books, and I hope that with this map, you'll be able to chart a path and find true enjoyment in the series as I have. I'm also going to do my best to avoid spoilers, but be warned that sometimes just the name of a series or book will kind of give away that that thing happens. Also, if I tell you that a certain character is in a book, then you also kind of know that they're alive at that time. So that's my spoiler warning. So the fundamental organizing principle in Dragonlance is the book series. All books belong to a series, often a trilogy, but sometimes a series of maybe 4 or 5 or any number of books really. So what I'll be doing is I'll be going through all of the Dragonlance books series by series to explain a little bit of what the books are about and how they fit within the larger Dragonlance saga. I organize all the different series into different types and also into 3 different chronological eras. I've kind of made up these eras, but they are based on the real-world development cycles that the series went through, and I think they're useful at giving a higher-level view of the overall Dragonlance saga. The 3 eras that I'll be using are the Classic Era, which chronologically encompasses the first 4 ages of Krynn and is associated with the earliest Dragonlance development cycle, which ran between 1984 to 1995, so just over a decade of time here. Next, we have the Fifth Age era, which deals mostly with the early Fifth Age of Krynn and consists mostly of books published between 1996 and 2000. So here it's about 5 years of development. The final era is the Age of Mortals, and this starts with the War of Souls trilogy and includes works published between 2000 to 2010. So roughly another decade of development. I try to place the eras and book series in roughly chronological order, with the earliest on the bottom of the map and the most recent on the top. It's not perfect because some books and series encompass very large amounts of time, but I think it's better than nothing. So let's start with the best place to start reading Dragonlance, and that is in the classic era, where it all began. We'll start with the Chronicles trilogy, written by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. First we have Dragons of Autumn Twilight, which came out in 1984, followed by Dragons of Winter Night and Dragons of Spring Dawning, which both came out in 85. This is the epic adventure that started out the entire series. It lays out the grand sweep of the setting and introduces a memorable cast of characters that I'll refer to as the Companions. The very first book, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, was groundbreaking in many ways. It was initially intended to be a supporting tie-in for a series of game modules in the newly created D&D Dragonlance setting. But then that first book burst onto the New York Times bestseller list and eclipsed the game setting. TSR was the company that owned the setting, and they realized that they had something special in their hands. Dragons of Autumn Twilight likely single-handedly launched their entire D&D fiction line. Because it was blazing a new path, the first book was still figuring a lot of things out. It was also written in a 3-month time crunch, so some parts can read a bit like a narration of an RPG adventure, but by the time the second and third books came out, the authors really started to find their own voice and put the story first. This was followed the next year by the Legends trilogy, also by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. We have Time of the Twins, and then War of the Twins, and followed by Test of the Twins. These all came out in 1986. The Legends trilogy continues soon after Chronicles ends, and the story focuses on the twins, and includes a few more companions like Tasselhoff, Tanis, and Kitiara. This trilogy is a fan favorite and is seen by some people as a step up from Chronicles, and as well as maybe some of the best storytelling in the entire series. Together, these 6 books form the foundation of the Dragonlance Saga and are unofficially known as the Holy Six. They sort of set the standard and, in that time, created a lot of demand for more Dragonlance novels. They're nearly universally recommended as the starting point for new readers. Later on, I'll mention some other possible entry points that have been suggested, but personally, I think it is best to start with these 6 books first, and then branch out later. You see, since these were the first 6 books published, most other Dragonlance books kind of assume you've already read them, and they might accidentally spoil things if you haven't read Chronicles and Legends. Let's continue on now with the remaining core books in the classic era. First, we have the Second Generation. This came out in 1994, also by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. So the Second Generation came out pretty much a decade after Dragons of Autumn Twilight, and unusually this book is not a novel. It's actually an anthology of 5 individual short stories. And actually these stories are a bit longer than the typical short stories, so they're sometimes called novellas. 3 of the novellas were previously published in the Tales trilogy, and 2 of them are new to this book. All of these novellas push the core storyline forwards from the Legends trilogy and involve descendants of the Companions, hence the name The Second Generation. This anthology provides vital backstory to the next major book, which is Dragons of Summer Flame. This came out in 1995, also by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. People had been waiting a really long time after Legends to see what the next major story event would be in Dragonlance, and after about 8 years of waiting after Legends, Dragons of Summer Flame finally came out. I believe that Dragons of Summer Flame was originally intended to be a trilogy, but stuff happened and it got released as a single book. The result is actually a great book. It's fast-paced, action-packed, and filled with wonderful characters. It's possibly one of my favorite books in the entire Dragonlance series. And while initially the second generation and Dragons of Summer Flame were released as sort of individual standalone books, you'll find that Dragonlance as a rule really hates having standalone books that don't exist within a series. Dragonlance wants all books to be in a series. So sometimes these two books are grouped together as like a 2-book second generation series. Other times people try and put them into chronicles. Maybe they'll say Dragons of Summer Flame is the 4th Chronicles book because of how the naming convention lines up with the seasons. Other people will say second generation is the 4th Chronicles, Summer Flame is the 5th. But then, of course, you've got, the Legends trilogy that chronologically occurs in between there. So there's disagreement about exactly how to classify what series these books fit into. But either way, the block of Chronicles to Legends to second generation to Summer Flame creates a single solid story unit that really defines the core storyline to Dragonlance. I personally call this block of 8 books the classic core, and I consider Dragons of Summer Flame to mark the end of the classic era. At this point, I want to mention the Lost Chronicles, even though they were written much later. So some 20 years after the original Chronicles, Margaret and Tracy went back and revisited their roots with a trilogy known as the Lost Chronicles. First we have Dragons of the Dwarven Depths, which came out in 2006, followed by Dragons of the High Lord Skies in 2007, and then Dragons of the Hourglass Mage in 2009. You'll notice the blue background I put behind them here. This is simply to indicate that these books were published during the future 2000 to 2010 Age of Mortals development era, but chronologically, they belong back here with the original Chronicles. This trilogy is a really interesting concept. It revisits the original Chronicles and fills in gaps and offers new perspectives on that original story. It's fascinating to see how Margaret and Tracy were able to weave these new stories into the constraints of the original Chronicles framework. You see, the original Chronicles was based on a series of 16 gaming D&D modules. These game modules were themselves pretty groundbreaking at the time because it was the first time such a long, interconnected gaming campaign had ever been produced. But because it was so long, the Chronicles wasn't able to fit in everything. Dragons of Autumn Twilight, for example, only covers the first 2 modules. So a lot of stuff was cut out, and this left some gaps in that original storyline. Those gaps were the seeds that allow the Lost Chronicles to exist. Chronologically, Dwarven Depths slots in perfectly between Autumn Twilight and Winter Night, while the other 2 books more parallel the events in Winter Night and Spring Dawning, respectively. Because the Lost Chronicles was published 20 years after the original Chronicles, there are several opinions about the best time to read the Lost Chronicles. The first opinion that some people have is they suggest reading the Lost Chronicles interwoven with the original Chronicles. So you would read Autumn Twilight, then Dwarven Depths, then Winter Night, then High Lord Skies, then Spring Dawning, then Hourglass Mage. So basically bouncing back and forth between the 2 series. I strongly recommend not doing this. Lost Chronicles contains way too many spoilers to the original Chronicles trilogy, and bouncing back and forth between the 2 trilogies ruins the overall pacing for both of them. The second opinion some people have is to suggest reading the Lost Chronicles right after reading the original Chronicles. I also do not recommend this. The significance of many things that occur in the Lost Chronicles will be lost on you if you haven't yet read Legends. You'll miss out on a lot of the references. The third option is to read the Lost Chronicles after Legends, and I think this works. There are some minor hints and references to events that occur in the second generation and Dragons of Summer Flame, but there's nothing too serious, so this you can do. Or the fourth option is to read the Lost Chronicles anytime after Dragons of Summer Flame. And this is actually my personal recommendation. This way there are no real spoilers, and it becomes a really good nostalgia trip. It's kind of a unique experience to read the Lost Chronicles after reading about all the other things that happen in the future, because you get to return back to this original time period when everyone was young and innocent and go adventure with the companions again. It's almost like you can go home again. I would classify this trilogy as quasi-core. It's not quite a core story, but it exists very close and parallel to the core storyline. And so that's why I position it here with the little dashed line, sort of connecting it to that core storyline. So that finishes off the classic era core novels, but it's just scratching the surface for what this era has to offer. There are so many more book series here that really flesh out the setting. For example, I mentioned that the second generation is mostly a compilation of pre-existing novellas. So let's take a look at where those were first printed. We'll start with the Tales series. This was originally a trilogy of short story anthologies that were all published in 1987. So they came out the year after Legends came out. We have The Magic of Krynn, Kender, Gully Dwarves and Gnomes, and Love and War. The short stories in each book tend to relate to the themes mentioned in the titles, and it kind of makes sense that these were the very first books published after Legends came out, because TSR was already publishing some short stories in their Dragon magazine, and they could take some of those and reprint them in an anthology form. And it's also easier to write and publish short stories, and I'm sure they wanted to get more content out as soon as possible once they saw they had a hit on their hands with Chronicles and Legends. Each of these books contains a longer novella that is depicted on the original covers, and these were the novellas that were later reprinted in the second generation. Then, after a 5-year gap, in 1992, a second trilogy came out that was called Tales 2. So in 1992, we got The Reign of Istar, The Cataclysm, and The War of the Lance. Here, the organizing principle within these books are these 3 different time periods. So, for example, The Reign of Istar contains short stories set during that time period, during the Reign of Istar. The original cover art also matched novellas that were in each book written by Margaret and Tracy. The novellas for the first 2 books form a continuous story, and you can kind of see the characters are the same in the covers there, while the novella in the 3rd book stands alone. There are stories about gully dwarves, one in each book that flows through these books, and a lot more really fun and interesting short stories. I'd say these books are a lot of fun, and they add a lot of flavor to Dragonlance. Tales first introduced new authors to Dragonlance and began the long tradition of having short story anthologies in the Dragonlance Saga. Some of the stories here would go on to form seeds for future books or contain characters that reappear elsewhere. Short stories have a long tradition of also being reprinted. We saw how the novellas in the first 3 books get reprinted in the second generation. And you'd find that actually all 6 books would be reprinted again later as a single 6-book series called Tales, and they would also later get new cover art. Some of the more popular stories were then taken out of these books and then reprinted again in future anthologies. In fact, let's take a look at those right now. I call these the best of anthologies. First, we have Best of Tales Volume 1, which came out in 2000, and this reprints some of the short stories from the first 3 books of Tales. And it includes also one extra piece of content, a short story called The Traveling Players of Gillian. And this is about a magical troupe of traveling actors. In 2002, we got Best of Tales Volume 2, which reprints some of the best stories from the second 3 books in the Tales series. And it also includes an extra piece of content, in this case a D&D adventure called the Anvil of Time that's set around a time-traveling device. Each of these best of anthologies contains about a dozen reprinted short stories, plus that one extra piece of new content. This new content gives you a reason to purchase these reprints, even if you already own the full Tale series. What's interesting is that both of these pieces of extra content, both the Traveling Players of Gillian short story and the Anvil of Time adventure, would themselves go on to become framing devices for other books in the future. There's one more anthology that sort of fits in here, even though it maybe doesn't fit in the classic era, and that is Dragons in the Archives, the Best of Weis and Hickman anthology, which came out in 2004. This anthology includes reprints of the cover stories from the second 3 Tales books. So the novellas from the first 3 got reprinted in the second generation, and the novellas from the last 3 got reprinted here. It also includes reprints from other anthologies from later eras, and includes a bunch of retrospective essays written by the authors. There is one piece of extra content here in the form of a Margaret Weis short story called Honor and Guile that's reprinted from Dragon magazine and had not previously been printed in book form. While we're discussing anthologies, there's one more series of short story anthologies that I want to touch on before we get back to the novels, and that is the Dragons anthologies. So these books were one-off anthologies that were later kind of retroactively grouped together into a single series. It starts out in 1994 with The Dragons of Krynn, and the basic conceit is to have an anthology of short stories where all of them are related to dragons. There are a couple of stories here that tie into other books. For example, we have the first Dragon Army Bridging Company, which introduces a group of fan-favorite draconian engineers. We also have Kaz and the Dragon's Children, which is a short story involving Kaz, who is a Minotaur character that appears in other books. Not surprisingly, dragons are very popular, and so this book was soon followed by a sequel. In 1996, we got The Dragons at War. There are also some tie-in and notable short stories here. The first is Glory Descending, which tells of the fall of Castle Crownguard, which is connected to a character you meet in Chronicles. We also have the first Dragon Army Engineer's Secret Weapon, which continues the story about the Draconian engineers we met in the Dragons of Krynn. And we also have Aurora's Eggs, which is a short story about a dragon named Aurora and her eggs, and it sets up another book about dragons. In 1998, we got The Dragons of Chaos, and this was published in the Fifth Age era, so that's why it has a red background on it to match the background for the Fifth Age era. One notable story here is Tavern Tales, which deals with characters who appear in the book Makesta Carthan. Finally, in 2007, we have Dragons of Time, and one tie-in story here is The Eight, which involves the character Linsha, who reappears in some other novels in the future. So, those are the Dragons anthologies, and I want to just, again, note that the background colors here are simply indicating when these books were published, so what era they were published in. But I grouped them all together here because they're sort of in one series. Dragons of Chaos was published in the Fifth Age era, Dragons of Time published in the Age of Mortals era. Anyway, that concludes all of the anthology series that we have for the classic era, and we can go back to the normal novels now. Okay, so imagine we're back in the 1980s. Chronicles and Legends have just come out. They're hot stuff. Now, if you are at TSR, what do you do next? Short stories can be a good way to fill in a gap, but fans want more. The answer is you give them prequels. Yes, prequels. This is an easy, low-risk choice that satisfies all this built-up demand. And so this is where we get the Preludes series. And unfortunately, at this point, I also have to bring up the C word. Yes, the C word, canon. Not all of the stories here are recognized as canon. Some stories actually don't make too much sense in light of what happens in Chronicles. This is kind of inevitable in large shared universes like Dragonlance. And non-canon stories in Dragonlance are sometimes referred to as Kender tales, so basically exaggerated fantastical stories. But some of these prequel books do stay close to canon. So here's the context. In the opening scene of the Chronicles, the companions reunite after being apart for 5 years, where they had agreed to split up and search out evidence of the true gods. The Prelude series tells the stories of what happened in this 5-year gap right before Chronicles, and it starts with a trilogy of books that were all published in 1989. First we have Darkness and Light by Paul B. Thompson and Tonya C. Cook. You're going to discover that Paul and Tonya are absolute rock stars, and they show up many more times writing other books, and I usually really like their work. Tonya, right now, on this book, appears as Tonya R. Carter, but she changes her name later to Tonya C. Cook after getting married. So this book tells the story of Sturm and Kitiara, and what happened to them when they head off together during that 5-year gap. It's a very fun story, but it's infamous as a non-canon Kender tale. Suffice it to say that some really unbelievable things happen. Next we have Kendermore by Mary Kirchoff. Mary was originally an editor at TSR, and she got involved with Dragonlance from very early on. She would go on to write several more books for Dragonlance, and I generally like her work as well. This book is about Tasselhoff's adventures back in Kendermore. Like most other Kender-based stories, it's pretty lighthearted and fun. And then we have Brothers Magir by Kevin Stein. This is Kevin's only Dragonlance novel, though he does write some short stories for the series. This is about Raistlin and Caramon, and how they get involved with a mystery and some intrigue in the city of Meriklar. I thought it was a pretty fun read, but I'm not sure exactly how canon it is. This was quickly followed up by the Preludes 2 trilogy the next year in 1990, and then later all 6 books were reprinted as a single Prelude series and then reprinted again with new cover art. So the first book here we have is Riverwind the Plainsman by Paul B. Thompson and Tonya C. Cook. So this tells the story of Riverwind and his quest. It actually occurs almost immediately before the events of Chronicles and leads right into them. I've heard it described as sort of like how Rogue One leads directly into the original Star Wars movie. I think that's a good analogy there. It's a good read, and it is sort of the truest prequel to Chronicles out of all the other books in this series. Next we have Flint the King by Mary Kirchoff and Douglas Niles. So Mary returns, teaming up with Douglas Niles. And Doug goes on to write a lot more Dragonlance novels and short stories. And he's also involved on the gaming side. You're going to see his name pop up quite a lot. He will also write more about dwarves in the future, and I generally like his work. This book is Flint's story in the years before Chronicles, where he heads back to his home in Hillholm. He gets involved with some dwarven drama, has a love interest, and encounters some gully dwarves. The last book here is Tanis the Shadow Years by Barbara and Scott Siegel. This is Barbara and Scott's only Dragonlance novel, though they did contribute some short stories in the original Tales trilogy. This story is about Tanis's magical adventure through a person's memory, and he also gets to look very hunky on the cover. I'm not sure if it's canon. Overall, I'd say the Preludes are a bit of a mixed bag. Not really the high point of Dragonlance. They might be worth reading, though, if you're interested in specific characters and you want more stories with them. It's always nice to see Flint get the limelight, and the Riverwind book does make a pretty good prequel to Chronicles. Next we have The Meetings Sextet. This series was the first time we saw TSR committing out of the gate for a series of 6 books. It was released soon after Preludes, but chronologically occurs before Preludes. It details how the companions first meet each other, and it was actually my personal entrance to the Dragonlance Saga. So these are essentially origin stories. We start out with Kindred Spirits in 1991 with Mark Anthony and Ellen Porath. This is Mark Anthony's only Dragonlance novel, though he contributes several short stories. Ellen Porath does come back to write a few more novels. In this book, Tanis and Flint meet each other for the first time in Qualinost. It's an interesting look at the life that Tanis had in Qualinost that was kind of alluded to in the Chronicles. Next, we have Wanderlust, also in 1991, by Mary Kirchoff and Steve Winter. This time, Mary teams up with her husband, Steve Winter. This is her second book dealing with Tasselhoff, and this is the story where Tasselhoff first meets Flint and Tanis. And then the 3 of them team up in a crazy adventure. In 1992, we get Darkheart by Tina Danielle, and this is Tina's first Dragonlance novel. She will come back to write 2 more. This book is mostly about Kitiara. We get to see her interact with her father when she's young, as well as her mother, and deal with the birth of her 2 twin brothers. It also gives us a good snapshot of the twin brothers' early childhood and them growing up. Also in 92, we have The Oath and the Measure by Michael Williams. Now, Michael wrote all of the poetry in the Chronicles and Legends trilogies, so he's been involved with Dragonlance from the very beginning. I really like him as an author, and he brings a different voice to the setting. He writes several more Dragonlance books, often dealing with knights. This book is the story of young Sturm's background and how he develops some relationships with some friends and enemies that come back later on in Chronicles. It fits in quite well with the Chronicles trilogy and provides some good background. Also in 92, we have Steel and Stone by Ellen Porath. So Ellen comes back to continue Tanis' story, and this time it's how he meets Kitiara and how that infamous relationship starts off. And finally in 93, we have The Companions by Tina Danielle. And now everybody knows each other, and it's time for the whole gang to get together and go off on a crazy adventure together. Maybe a little bit too crazy, and it's definitely not canon. So, the Meeting Sextet. I'd say it's another mixed bag. The books can all be read as one-off stories, though there is sort of a progression between them as, they meet each other, and eventually it leads up to the conclusion in the 6th book where they go off on a grand adventure with everybody. But you get some issues with different authors sharing the iconic characters, and that's also a problem that Preludes had. Compounding this, many of the stories contain elements that just, they don't agree with what happens in Chronicles. And I'd say that Kindred Spirits, Darkheart, and The Oath and the Measure, those books do a decent job with capturing the characters and telling a story that works within the expectations of the Chronicles trilogy. Again, I would recommend reading the books here if you're interested in following specific characters. But also be ready to take the stories as they are and accept that they might not be canon. Next up, we have the Raistlin Chronicles that are all about Raistlin and Caramon. We start out with The Soulforge in 1998 by Margaret Weis. So Margaret comes back to write a novel about young Raistlin and him growing up and taking his test. This was a very popular and well-received book that many people consider a must-read. There is another version of the story where Raistlin takes his test. It's a short story called The Test of the Twins, and it's in The Magic of Kryn. This book, The Soulforge, kind of replaces that short story. The Soulforge was also inspired by an earlier book called The Soulforge, which came out in 1985 and was part of a series of choose-your-own-adventure books, 4 of which were set in the Dragonlance universe. And I don't include them in this map because I don't really consider them mainline Dragonlance novels. But they were interesting because unlike traditional choose-your-own-adventure books, you actually played the book, usually by rolling dice to determine what option you would take. And then this was followed up in 99 by Brothers in Arms, this time by Don Perrin and Margaret Weis. So Margaret comes back with her husband, Don Perrin, to write a sequel to The Soulforge. This novel was also very well received and recounts Raistlin and Caramon's days working as mercenaries after the test. In some ways, this is the story you would have expected Brothers Magier to be. Raistlin was the breakout fan favorite character from Chronicles, and it's great having these stories of his earlier days. The Raistlin Chronicles are definitely worth reading, and are kind of like preludes done right. Soulforge chronologically occurs after the events in Meeting Sextet, and Brothers in Arms occurs just after that. So I've positioned them chronologically sort of between the Meetings and Preludes series. I also consider them more like quasi-core books, sort of like the Lost Chronicles. So I've connected them to the core storyline with a dashed line here. Some people might even consider them core books outright and suggest reading them first before reading the Chronicles as the entry point to Dragonlance. I think personally that spoils some of the things in the Chronicles. So my vote is still for Chronicles as the entry point. But, I can understand that logic. All right, let's move on to the final prequel series. The Villains series focuses on the villain characters from the Chronicles trilogy. In 1993, we get Before the Mask by Michael and Terry Williams. Michael returns with his wife Terry to tell us the origin story for Verminard. He's one of the big bad guys in Chronicles. Also in 93, we get The Black Wing by Mary Kirchoff, and Mary tells us the story of the evil black dragon, Casanth. This is one of the few full-length novels to include a large portion of it from the dragon's point of view. Then in 93, we also get Emperor of Ansalon by Douglas Niles, and Doug tells us the story of Ariakus, another big baddie from the Chronicles that definitely deserves his own novel. In 94, we get Hedrick the Theocrat by Ellen Dodge Severson, and this is actually Ellen Porath after she changed her name. Hedrick is a pretty minor character in Chronicles, but she manages to develop him into a real character. Also in 94, we get Lord Toady by Jeff Grubb, and Lord Toady is another minor character in Chronicles that makes a brief appearance early on, and then is barely mentioned once or twice more. But somehow Jeff Grubb manages to write an entire book about Lord Toady. And also, I don't know how, but this book is a masterpiece. It's a comedic masterpiece. It's highly recommended. Note that there is a short story called Lord Toady's Disastrous Hunt. And this occurs before the events in this book. It is found in the Tales anthology Kender, Gully Dwarves, and Gnomes. And then also in 94, we get The Dark Queen by Michael and Terry Williams. This book kind of stands out from the rest of this series because the Dark Queen refers to an evil goddess, and it's kind of difficult to write a book with a goddess as the main character. So she's not the main character, and the book is not really about her. It's also set way back in the past, hundreds of years before the Chronicles trilogy, back in the time of Istar, so it breaks the prequel mold that the rest of the series fits into. Although, to be fair, Lord Toady does actually take place after the Chronicles, but that book's allowed to break any rule at once. Anyway, The Dark Queen is an interesting story about some of her scheming in the past, but it's kind of an odd fit in this series. Overall, the Villains series is also a bit of a mixed bag. Many of the villains didn't have much depth in Chronicles, so the authors had a bit more of a blank slate to develop them and create their stories. The books are decent, but the series doesn't feel super cohesive. It's worth reading about particular villains that you might be interested in. And that finishes up all of the prequel series. There are 20 books here total. You'll notice I've also divided up the map into columns. The core books make up the middle column. The prequel books are to the right of that, and then further to the right, I put all of the anthologies. Directly to the left of the core books is a column I call one-off. That's for book series where the individual books are typically one-off books that can be read by themselves. That's sort of like the Villains and the Prelude series, because each of those books are one-off. But I think it makes sense to separate those into a separate prequel column. And then the leftmost column I call trilogy, and consists mostly of traditional trilogies that flow together like chronicles or legends, and you have a continuous story arc. Next, we'll look at the classic era one-off series. Here we have the Heroes series. This was originally a trilogy of books that were published in 1988, and this is right after the first 3 Tales books were published in 87, and before the Preludes or anything else. So the Heroes trilogy was actually the first novels in the Dragonlance series to be published after Legends. So we'll start out with The Legend of Huma by Richard A. Knaak. Richard was very new to the writing world when this came out, and The Legend of Huma was his first published novel. It became a New York Times best-selling book, and he has gone on to write many more novels and short stories for Dragonlance, as well as for other popular series like for Warcraft and Diablo, and of course he has his own series. This book tells the legendary story of Huma. Huma is referenced many times throughout the Chronicles trilogy as a hero, cloaked in myth from ages past. This book is definitely an epic tale that captures a lot of the feeling of the original Chronicles trilogy, but in a single volume, and is highly recommended. I've heard some people recommend reading this book immediately after reading the Holy Six, and that's not a bad idea. This book also introduces the character Kaz, the Minotaur, who reappears as a main character in other books, and it sort of kicking off the overall Minotaur storyline that threads through Dragonlance. Next we have Stormblade by Nancy Varian Berberick, and this is Nancy's first Dragonlance novel, and it tells the story about what was happening in the dwarven kingdom of Thorbardin during the events in Chronicles. Nancy will go on to pen several more Dragonlance books and short stories, and I generally like her writing. This book fills in some interesting gaps and gives more of a dwarven perspective to the events during Chronicles. It's sort of like an earlier version of Dragons of Dwarven Depths from the Lost Chronicles. And the next book here is Weasel's Luck by Michael Williams. This one was actually Michael's first book that he wrote, and it was published before The Oath and the Measure. It tells the story of a young Galen growing up in a knight's household in the years before Chronicles. That first trilogy of Heroes books did well, so in 1990, a second Heroes 2 trilogy was published that sort of extends the first one, and then later both trilogies would be reprinted as a single 6-book series called Heroes, and they would also get new covers. We start this out with Kaz the Minotaur by Richard A. Knaak. Richard returns with a novel, and this time it's all about Kaz the Minotaur, and this is a sequel to The Legend of Huma. It's at this point that Richard basically takes ownership of the Minotaur race on Krynn and becomes responsible for developing them in future novels. I also want to point out that the short story Kaz and the Dragon's Children in the Dragons of Krynn anthology occurs between The Legend of Huma and Kaz the Minotaur. It's not necessary to reading that if you want to read Kaz the Minotaur, but I just wanted to throw that out there. The next book is The Gates of Thorbardin by Dan Parkinson. Dan begins a tradition of writing Dragonlance books involving dwarves. Although thematically, this book is about dwarves, just like Stormblade was about dwarves, these two books are not actually connected narratively. This is a fun story that also touches on several elements that you find in the core storyline, although it kind of winds up contradicting some things in Dragons of the Dwarven Depths, but I wouldn't get hung up on that. The final book in this series is Galen Benighted by Michael Williams. Galen Benighted is a sequel to The Weasel's Luck, and it continues that storyline, and I kind of like both of those books. Overall, the Heroes series is pretty high quality. It was one of the earliest series of books published, and they still hold up very well. Huma is a must-read, and Kaz is a worthy sequel. Stormblade and Gates of Thorbardin are both good reads, and they're both kind of interesting in light of what happens in the Lost Chronicles. And then Weasel's Luck and Galen Benighted form a solid 2-book story. All told, a decent set of books that connect well with the larger Dragonlance setting. Next we have the Warriors series, which is oddly 7 books. It starts out in 95 with Knights of the Crown by Roland Green. Roland will go on to write 4 Dragonlance books altogether, and they all form a continuous narrative within this Warriors series. Knights of the Crown is the first, and it follows the protagonist, Pervin, who works to try and become a Knight of Solamnia. The story takes place more than 100 years before Chronicles, and it's not really connected to it. Next, also in 95, we have Makesta Carthan. This time, it's by Tina Danielle and Jean Rabe. So Tina returns after writing Darkheart and The Companions in the Meeting Sextet. She teams up with Jean Rabe, even though Jean is not credited on the cover. Jean Rabe would go on to become a very important writer in the Dragonlance Saga and write several more books. This book reads sort of like a prequel novel concerning Makesta Carthan, who is a minor character in the Chronicles trilogy. And note, there is that short story Tavern Tales in Dragons of Chaos that ties in with this book and has a lot of the characters in there. In 95, we also get Knights of the Sword by Roland Green, and this continues the adventures of Sir Pervin. In 96, we get Theros Ironfeld by Don Perrin. So Don was married to Margaret Weis, and this was his first solo Dragonlance novel, and it's all about Theros Ironfeld, who is another minor character from the Chronicles trilogy. It tells his background and leads right into the Chronicles trilogy, sort of like how Riverwind the Plainsman did. Next, in 96, we get Knights of the Rose by Roland Green. So more adventures of Sir Pervin. And in 96, we also get Lord Soth by Ido van Belkom. Now this is Ido's sole Dragonlance novel, and it is concerning the famous Lord Soth. It details his horrible tragedy and downfall. Finally, in 97, we get The Wayward Knights by Roland Green, and this is the final book concerning Sir Pervin and his group of wayward knights that he's picked up over the course of the last several novels. Overall, I'd say that the Warriors series is not my favorite. It suffers from a bit of an identity crisis, where you have 3 of the books being one-off prequel stories about minor characters from the Chronicles trilogy, and then interspersed with these 3 books are 4 books from a different time period completely that form a continuous story arc about Sir Pervin, who is a character that is disconnected from the core Dragonlance storyline. He's also not really my favorite character, and I was kind of surprised to see that the whole Pervin story arc got 4 novels. It's also just worth pointing out how the first 3 books were published in 95, and they shared a common frame style, and then they switched to a more generic frameless cover art style in 96 when Dragonlance entered into the 5th Age era of development. If you're into the Knights of Solamnia, then I might consider reading Knights of the Crown to see if you like this story. If you do, then you can continue on to Sword, Rose, and Wayward Knights. And then if you're interested in reading about the characters Makesta, Theros, or Soth, then you can definitely pick up their prequel stories here. Next, we have the Classics series. This is a miscellaneous series of one-off novels set in the Classic era. Starts out with Murder in Tarsus, which came out in 1996 by John Maddox Roberts. This is John's sole Dragonlance book, and The novel was originally printed in 96 in hardcover as part of a different series. It was a fantasy murder mystery series that was known as Mysteries and was based mostly in the Forgotten Realms. And this is the sole crossover from Dragonlance. So that put it in kind of a weird spot without an actual home in a Dragonlance series. So in 1999, when it was reprinted in softcover, it was as part of this newly minted Classics series. It's a murder mystery novel set in the city of Tarsus. It's also a bit shorter than most traditional Dragonlance novels because it has this strange origin in a different series. Then in the year 2000, we get Dalamar the Dark by Nancy Varian Berberick, and this is Dalamar's origin story before he shows up in the Legends. Also in 2000, we have The Citadel by Richard A. Knaak, and The Citadel is a fun tale set in the chaotic period after the Chronicles trilogy involving flying citadels. In 01, we get The Inheritance by Nancy Varian Berberick. Here, Nancy tells the story of a kidnapped elven princess from Qualinesti. It occurs about a century before Chronicles, and it does wind up being obliquely connected to the events in that trilogy. The Classic series is quite a mishmash of different one-off stories. We have a murder mystery, an origin story for Dalamar, a high-flying adventure, and then a kidnapping story. Next is the Anvil of Time series. This is another miscellaneous series of one-off books. The stories are set back in the classic era of Dragonlance, but they were written in the Age of Mortals development era. They share a framing device where you have a mysterious journeyman who uses a time-traveling machine to travel back in time to the classic era to give us these stories. This time-traveling machine was first introduced in the Best of Tales Volume 2 as that extra D&D adventure module that they put in there called the Anvil of Time. There is a small chance for small spoilers since the Journeyman is coming from a future era, but it's pretty minor. We have The Sellsword in 2008 by Cam Banks. This is Cam's only Dragonlance novel, although he has contributed extensively on the gaming side. It's a fun book about a mercenary with a magical sword set in Nordmar around the time of the Legends trilogy. Also in 2008, we have The Survivors by Dan Willis. Dan had previously written a short story in the Dragonlance Saga, as well as several books set in the young adults line. This is his only novel set in the main Dragonlance series. The Survivors follows a village of dwarves that struggle to survive during the Cataclysm. In 2009, we get Renegade Wizards by Lucien Solban. This is Lucien's second Dragonlance novel. The first is Alien Sea in the Champions series, which is set in the future Age of Mortals era. Renegade Wizards is set in the years before Chronicles, and it's a story about some wizards of high sorcery hunting down Renegade Wizards. In 2009, we also get The Forest King by Paul B. Thompson. So this time Paul returns alone to tell the story of the famous elf Bailiff and his strange fate. It's set thousands of years in the past, back at the dawn of civilization, and also involves the early history of the Kender race. This series is a decent set of eclectic books that can be worth reading. The Anvil of Time framing device is kind of cute, but it's not super important. Next, we have the Lost Legends series. This is another collection of one-off novels set in the Classic era, but was published in 1997. Start out with Vinus Solemnis by J. Robert King. This is J. Robert King's sole Dragonlance novel. It tells the story of the legendary founder of the Solemnic Knights, the eponymous Vinus Solemnis. It takes place thousands of years in the past, back in the Age of Dreams. Next, we have Fistandantilus Reborn by Douglas Niles. So this book tells a story about the infamous wizard Fistandantilus and his desperate drive to stay alive. It skips around different time periods a bit, and it does involve Kender. Finally, we have Tales of Uncle Trapspringer by Dixie Lee McKeon. This was Dixie's sole Dragonlance novel, and it's about a crazy magical adventure with the famous kender, Uncle Trapsbringer. One odd thing about this book is that it was originally published as a standalone book outside of any series, and only later was it retroactively classified as part of the Lost Legends series. That's why it doesn't have any Lost Legends text on the cover art. This series is another opportunity to pick and choose stories that you're interested in. If you want to learn more about the founder of the Solamnic Knights, then pick up Vinus Solamnis. Interested more about what may have happened to Fistandantilus, or an adventure with the actual Uncle Trapsbringer, then you can pick those up. The next series is Lost Histories. I like the idea behind the Lost Histories series. It's a lot more cohesive than some of the other one-off series. The idea here is to fill in the histories for races that hadn't yet received much attention in the novels. We'll start out in 1995 with The Kaganesti by Douglas Niles. Doug starts off this series with a book about the Wild Elves, or Kaganesti. It begins in the distant past and then jumps forward to different periods of history, and it makes a good companion to the Elven Nations trilogy. Next, also in 95, we have The Urda by Linda P. Baker. This is Linda's first Dragonlance novel. She also writes a bunch of short stories and will come back to write one more novel with Nancy Varian Berberick. The Urda takes place many thousands of years in the past and describes the downfall of the High Ogres and the birth of the Urda race. Also in 95, we have The Dragonesti by Paul B. Thompson and Tonya C. Cook. We see Paul and Tonya return with another novel centered around elves. This time it's about the Dragonesti race of sea elves and is set thousands of years in the past. This is another good companion to the Elven Nations trilogy. Next in 96, we have Land of the Minotaurs by Richard A. Knaak, and Richard returns with the sequel to Kaz the Minotaur. It's always fun to watch Kaz swing that axe. In 96, we also get The Gully Dwarves by Dan Parkinson. By this time, Dan had already written the novel The Gates of Thorbardin about dwarves, as well as the Dwarven Nations trilogy, all about dwarves. He also had written a series of connected short stories about gully dwarves that ran through the last 3 books in the Tales series. Those stories are Off Day, Ogre Unaware, and The Promised Place. And they're all about the Bulp clan of gully dwarves. So they act as a setup for this book. This book takes place during the Chronicles time period, not in the ancient past. And finally, also in 96, we have The Dragons by Douglas Niles. The Dragons starts out very far in the distant past. Chronologically, I believe it's the very first book in Kryn's history, followed by the Urda. It starts back with the early dragons before, I believe, even the other mortal races were created, and is a continuation of the short story Aurora's Eggs that we found in the Dragons at War anthology. This book is all about dragons, and it then progresses forwards from that early beginning through thousands of years of history. I find the Lost Histories series to be one of the more successful series of one-off books in the classic era. The books are generally pretty good, and all succeed in being about lesser-known races. You'll notice also that this series straddles that 1995-1996 divide between the classic and Fifth Age eras, just like the Warriors series. So again, we find that the first 3 books printed in 95 share a common frame for the cover art, while the last 3 printed in 96 are frameless. Maybe it's a pet peeve of mine, but I personally find it kind of annoying to have this kind of inconsistent look within a series. And I also am not a huge fan of the generic frameless style that they used in 96, because it makes novels that are from different series look like they're from the same series. It's just not obvious at first glance that the dragons, Vinus Solamnis, and Theros Ironfeld are from 3 different series, because it has the same style. Anyway, that wraps up all of the classic era one-off series. I tried to sort of put these down in chronological order, but it's kind of impossible because books within a single series might occur thousands of years apart. So now we can take a look at the traditional story arc trilogies in this classic era. I generally prefer trilogies as they have more space to tell deeper stories. I'll be going through these in reverse chronological order, starting with The Defenders of Magic. This series takes place just before Chronicles, and it's a really fun trilogy, and I definitely recommend reading it. In 94, we got Night of the Eye. Then in 94 again, we get the Medusa Plague, and then in 95, we get the Seventh Sentinel. These are all written by Mary Kirchoff. We previously saw that she wrote 2 prequel novels about Tasselhoff, as well as a prequel about Flint, and another about the dragon Chrysanth. In my opinion, the Defenders of Magic trilogy is her best work yet. It starts out with a couple of novice magic users, and we follow their journey from low-level apprentices studying magic to becoming powerful mages, and we follow how their relationships change over time. I'd say that the Dragonlance setting as a whole is a relatively low magic environment for a fantasy series, where magic users are distrusted and persecuted, and thus magic is rare. That can be good because it makes magic more special, but this trilogy is an opportunity to tell a Dragonlance story in a high magic environment, and it's a lot of fun. Next, we have the King Priest trilogy, and this is a trilogy that finally does justice to the King Priest and the Empire of Istar. In 2001, we have Chosen of the Gods, in 2002, Divine Hammer, and in 2003, Sacred Fire, all by Chris Pierson. Chris Pierson is what every Dragonlance fan secretly wants to be. He started reading Dragonlance books when he was young, became a fan, and dreamt of one day writing his own Dragonlance books. Then he grows up and does it, and does a great job. You may have encountered Istar and the King Priest in other books, but those books barely scratch the surface for this time period. And the King Priest trilogy is widely seen as one of the best trilogies in the whole Dragonlance saga, so I definitely recommend you go and read it. Next, we have the Ice Wall trilogy, and this is set in the southern Ice Wall region of Ansalon. In 2001, we get The Messenger, in 2002, The Golden Orb, and in 2003, Winterheim, all written by Douglas Niles. This trilogy by Douglas Niles is set about 1,000 years in the past and follows the story of an exiled Sylvanesti elf living with a human tribe who struggles against ogres in this southern Icewall region. This is a good series to pick up for a story set in a cold, polar environment. Next, we get the Elven Nations trilogy. This trilogy details the history of the Sylvanesti and Qualinesti nations. In 91, we get Firstborn, followed by the Kinslayer Wars, and then the Qualinesti, all written in 1991. This is actually the very first trilogy of novels that were to be published after Chronicles and Legends. We did see things like the Heroes trilogy come out, but that wasn't a true trilogy with a continuous story arc. Oddly, the first and third novels of this trilogy are written by Paul B. Thompson and Tonya C. Kirk, while the middle novel was written by Douglas Niles. It's very unusual to split the authors in a trilogy like this. I don't think it's ever done again. This is where we first see Paul and Tonya take ownership over the Elven races. We see they wrote the Darganesti, and that book kind of builds on this trilogy, as well as the Forest King, which also is a good companion for this trilogy. Douglas wrote the Kaganesti, which deals with the Wild Elves, and that could also be seen as a good companion to this trilogy here. This Elven Nations trilogy is classic Dragonlance, and I recommend reading it if you are at all interested in elves. It really forms the foundation for all of the elvish storylines that thread through the series, and I recommend reading it before the other elf-focused books like the Darganesti or Kaganesti or the Forest King. Next we have the Urgoth trilogy. This is a trilogy set in the ancient human empire of Urgoth. In '03, we have A Warrior's Journey. In '04, The Wizard's Fate. And also in '04, A Hero's Justice, all by Paul B. Thompson and Tonya C. Cook. Paul and Tonya come back to tell an epic story set back in the ancient empire of Urgoth, which was one of the first powerful human nations. It's an engaging trilogy with high-stakes palace intrigue. Urgoth's power has faded quite a lot by the time of the Chronicles trilogy, but in the ancient past it was one of the most powerful empires on Ansalon, and it's really good to see it get some attention here. Next we have the Dwarven Nations trilogy, which details the history of the dwarves and the founding of Thorbardin. In '93 we have the Covenant and the Forge, followed by the Hammer and Axe, also in '93, and then the Sword Sheath Scroll in '94. The dwarves of Ansalon have a long and rich history that Dan Parkinson is able to bring to life. We saw that Dan had previously written The Gates of Thorbardin, and here's where he really develops his affinity with dwarves. This was the next trilogy to be released after Elven Nations, and is another must-read if you're interested in dwarves. It gives essential background for all of the other dwarf-focused novels in the Dragonlance Saga. And finally, we have the Barbarians trilogy, which is a trilogy that follows the founding of the human barbarian nations. We start out in the year 2000 with Children of the Plains. Then in '01, we have Brother of the Dragon, and in '02, Sister of the Sword. These were all written by Paul B. Thompson and Tonya C. Cook. This is the final trilogy set in the classic era, and it was written by the capable hands of Paul and Tonya. It follows the story of a human brother and sister growing up on the plains, and includes things like the discovery of metal and writing. So you sort of have humanity coming out of the Stone Age and founding a nation. After the book The Dragons and the Urda, I think this trilogy is probably set the furthest back in the ancient past, back around the time of Bailiff, the Forest King, back when the world was young. And with that, we're finally finished with all of the books set in the classic era that ran from 1984 with the publishing of the Chronicles trilogy to 1995 with the publishing of Dragons of Summer Flame. 1996 represents the beginning of the Fifth Age era of Dragonlance development. And in addition to the move to full art covers that we already saw, there was another big change, and that is the logo. You can see that the new Dragonlance logo features golden metal wrapping instead of silver, and a big red dragon. In addition, the first major release in this era also had Fifth Age written across the logo in capital letters. So what is the Fifth Age and why do we have it? Well, Dragons of Summer Flame includes some world-changing events that cap off the end of the classic era, but there's kind of more to it than that. I think it's a good idea to get a little bit of perspective on some of the other things that were happening at this time on the corporate side of TSR, as well as on the gaming side of Dragonlance for better context. So TSR owned many intellectual properties, including Dungeons & Dragons, the Dragonlance world, and other worlds like Forgotten Realms. Over time, Forgotten Realms sort of became the default D&D setting, and Dragonlance kind of stagnated on the gaming side. And you can also get a sense of stagnation with the Dragonlance books back in the classic era. Although many novels and trilogies were released during the classic era, none of them actually advanced the storyline past the Legends trilogy that came out in 1986. Really, the only stories that advanced that storyline even a little bit were a handful of novellas, then until eventually Dragons of Summer Flame finally came out in 1995. So it's almost like in the classic era, things got frozen at just after the Legends trilogy. And you basically had a decade with lots of background and history and a lot of fleshing out of what the series is about, but no actual progression of the core storyline. I think people felt that Dragonlance needed a reboot, and that's where the Fifth Age comes in. In 1996, an entirely new RPG rule system called Saga was revealed for Dragonlance, as well as a whole slew of new gaming products that were planned for it. This was to be accompanied by new Dragonlance novels and series to be set in this new Fifth Age. Also, at the end of 1996, TSR wound up going bankrupt and being bought out by Wizards of the Coast. So 1996 was a big year of major transitions. Dragons of a New Age is the major new trilogy that was set to jumpstart this rebooted Fifth Age era. It starts out in 1996 with the dawning of a new age, in 97, the Day of the Tempest, and in 98, the Eve of the Maelstrom. These were all by Gene Rabe. This new trilogy was clearly aiming to replicate the original success of Chronicles and sort of followed a similar formula to generate interest in this new Fifth Age. You had a new cast of heroes that were standing up to new continent-wide evil threats, and you also had a series of gaming products that would parallel their adventure, just like the original Chronicles did. Unfortunately, there was quite a bit of controversy over the major changes involved in this reboot, and not all the fans were happy about it. First of all, this trilogy was written by Gene Rabe and not Margaret and Tracy. This rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Gene had at this point published several Dragonlance short stories, but only one novel, Makesta Carthan, and that wasn't a particularly notable novel. She wasn't even credited on the cover with co-author Tina Daniel. So some people were upset at handing her the reins and felt that the writing quality was not quite up to the expectations set by Margaret and Tracy. The other major issue with this trilogy is that it was saddled with the requirements of rebooting the entire setting. Jean wasn't free to tell any engaging story that she wanted. She had to fit in lots of details related to mechanical changes and how the world worked. And she had to work in new overarching themes and characters, and new obstacles all had to be set up. And so the first book in the trilogy winds up fast-forwarding through literally decades of time to try and incorporate all of these massive changes and give them time to play out a little bit before the main story actually begins. The result is one of the most polarizing trilogies in the Dragonlance series. Some people really like the writing, and they like the changes in the world, and it did succeed in breaking the stagnation and opening up new opportunities and storylines. Other people said it just didn't feel like Dragonlance anymore. So, should you read this? Is this a core trilogy like Chronicles or Legends? I think the best answer to that is a resounding maybe. I kind of classify it myself as a quasi-core trilogy, more like the Lost Chronicles or the Raistlin Chronicles. But it really does document a vast amount of changes as it reboots the Dragonlance setting, and chances are you might get a bit lost if you try to read other books past this without reading this trilogy first. So it might be worth reading the first book at least to catch up on most of these changes and see if you like the story and want to continue it. I think if you go in with more moderate expectations, then you might be able to enjoy it. Next, we have the Bridges of Time series. The Bridges of Time fills in the gaps between the end of Dragons of Summer Flame and the story in the Dragons of a New Age trilogy. So I've kind of put them in the prequel column. They're bridging that time gap. The books occur in those decades where the Dragons of New Age fast forwards through time. It starts out in 1998 with Spirit of the Wind by Chris Pierson. This is Chris's first Dragonlance novel, though we saw he would later write the King Priest trilogy. And this novel is about Riverwind and his adventure to Kendermore. Also in 98, we have Legacy of Steel by Mary H. Herbert. This is Mary's first Dragonlance book, and she goes on to publish several more, and winds up being one of my favorite authors in the series. This book deals with Sarah Dunstan, who is Steele's adoptive mother. Although she is a relatively minor character in the second generation, her actions here have important consequences to institutions in Ansalon. In 99, we get The Silver Stair by Jean Rabe. Jean tells us the story of Goldmoon and what she's building on Shalsea Island. Also in 99, The Rose and the Skull by Jeff Crook. This is Jeff's first Dragonlance novel, and he would go on to write several more. The Rose and the Skull is about the Knights of Solamnia and the Dark Knights trying to work together under the threat of dragons. And finally in 99, we have Desra's Quest by Chris Pierson. And this novel is about how Desra and Caramon get into an adventure with centaurs in Darkenwood. I'd say this series does an admirable job of filling in some of the gaps between Dragons of Summer Flame and Dragons of a New Age. In particular, Spirit of the Wind, Legacy of Steel, and The Silver Stair provide some good background on some of the newer things that are happening in the Fifth Age world. Next, we have the Chaos War series. This series sits on the border between the Classic Era and the Fifth Age era. The books actually take place during the events of Dragons of Summer Flame, but they were all written during the Fifth Age development cycle. So I've shifted them down to be parallel with Dragons of Summer Flame and kind of show their close connection to that time. While Dragons of Summer Flame probably should have been a trilogy, this series does a lot to make up for it only being a single book. These books show how the Chaos War really affected the entire world, and it really helps flesh out that time period. Starts out in 1996 with The Doom Brigade by Don Perrin and Margaret Weis. The Doom Brigade was published in 1996 as a standalone hardcover book outside of any series. As we know, Dragonlance doesn't like independent books, so when they printed the softcover version in 98, it was part of the Chaos War series. But then the Doom Brigade got a sequel, and so now it's no longer considered part of the Chaos War series at all, and it lives in a new series with its sequel. So pretend you don't see it here, and we'll move on to the real first book of the Chaos War series. In 1998, we get The Last Thane by Douglas Niles. As you can see, Doug has contributed quite a lot to Dragonlance. He's written books focused on elves, with the second book in the Elven Nations trilogy, as well as the Kaganesti, and he's also written about dwarves with Flint the King. And while Dan Parkinson was mostly seen as the dwarf guy, here we see Douglas Niles start to take over that reputation with The Last Thane. This book tells the story of how the Chaos War impacted the dwarven kingdom of Thorbardin, and it's a good book for dwarf fans. Next, also in 98, we have Tears of the Night Sky by Linda P. Baker and Nancy Varian Berberick. Linda and Nancy team up to tell a story about Chrysania and how she deals with the Chaos War. This book actually intersects directly with certain events that you see in Dragons of Summer Flame. In 1999, we have The Puppet King by Douglas Niles. So Doug returns with an elf book this time, focused on the Puppet King of Qualinesti during the Chaos War. Also in 99 is Reavers of the Blood Sea by Richard A. Knaak, and Richard gives us another Minotaur book, this time taking place during the Chaos War. It continues that Minotaur storyline from the Land of the Minotaurs in the Lost History series, and it can kind of be seen as a distant sequel to that book. And finally, in 99, we also have The Siege of Mount Nevermind by Fergus Ryan. This is Fergus's only Dragonlance novel, and it deals with how the Chaos War affected the gnomes of Mount Nevermind. So it's a gnome story. Let's take a look at the Kang's Regiment series, and we see that this is the series where the Doom Brigade really lives. Don Perrin wrote the first story about Kang's regiment in the First Dragon Army Bridging Company in the Dragons of Krynn anthology. And then later he teamed up with Margaret Weis and wrote the First Dragon Army Engineer's Secret Weapon in The Dragons at War. So this group of Draconians quickly became very popular, and here they get their own novel, The Doom Brigade. It's also a very popular book and is highly recommended. In 2000, we got Draconian Measures, also by Don Perrin and Margaret Weis. Since the Doom Brigade did so well, it got a sequel, Draconian Measures. That's another really great read. I also want to point out there is a short story called To Convince the Righteous of the Right, and it's from the Heroes and Fools anthology, and this story occurs between the events of the Doom Brigade and Draconian Measures. In fact, let's go take a look at that book series right now. All right, let's take a look at the Tales of the Fifth Age series now, which is a series of short story anthologies set in the Fifth Age. In 1998, we have Relics and Omens. In 99, Heroes and Fools. And the cover story here is for To Convince the Righteous of the Right by Margaret Weis and Don Perrin, which was that short story that fits in between the Doom Brigade and Draconian Measures. And then in the year 2000, we have Rebels and Tyrants. Now, this third book is actually more of a tie-in to the War of Souls trilogy in the next era, and it's probably best read after that. There is one story here, the Raid on the Academy of Sorcery, and that's kind of a bit of a sequel to some events that you learn about in the first book of the War of Souls trilogy, but I would read the War of Souls before reading that. And next we have another interesting series here. It's the Reader's Companion series. In 1999, we have The Odyssey of Gilthanas by Douglas Niles, Steve Miller, and Stan. The Odyssey of Gilthanas is a strange duck. First of all, it's got 3 authors. Second, it's the only book in its series. And third, it tries to be a combination novel and gaming source book, kind of a hybrid book. This book was clearly an experiment, and if it had gone well, then we probably would have seen more books in the Reader's Companion series. So I guess it wasn't that popular. The goal of this book was to introduce a lot of interesting places on Ansalon that could be used for gaming sessions. So we have the book sort of split in two. The first section of the book is the fiction story section, and in it we see Gilthanas wandering all around the continent, going to all these interesting places in his Odyssey. And then the second section of the book is a lengthy appendix that describes the locations again, but more as a gaming source book. It is an interesting read, and Gilthanas was always a character that I felt never seemed to get the attention he deserved. So if you want to see what happened to him, then read this book. Just, don't expect it to be a traditional novel experience. The next series here in the Fifth Age era is the Daemon trilogy. In 2001, we have Downfall. In 2002, Betrayal. And in 2003, Redemption, all by Jean Rabe. This is the final series set in the Fifth Age, and it is a trilogy by Jean Rabe that is essentially a sequel to her Dragons of a New Age trilogy. It includes a lot of the characters from that trilogy and focuses on Daemon's story arc. You may be able to guess that the story arc includes his downfall, a betrayal, and eventually redemption. If you liked the Dragons of a New Age trilogy, then you should definitely follow up and read the Daemon trilogy. And that pretty much wraps up the Fifth Age era. I come away from this era feeling like it was a giant experiment. What if we reboot the world, introduce a new cast of heroes and villains, and build new institutions, change up the mechanics, and release a new card-based gaming system focused on storytelling? It was a really bold ambition, but I think if we look at the number of novels that were actually set in this rebooted Fifth Age time period, it becomes clear that it wasn't really successful. Now, the actual number of books released between 96 and 2000 was respectable and, compares favorably to the rate of books that were released back in the classic era of 84 to 95. But many of the books that were released during this time period were actually set back in earlier time periods, not in the Fifth Age. For example, you have the Raistlin Chronicles, Lost Legends, Classics, The Warriors, and even the Chaos War. The only novels that really take place in this rebooted Fifth Age setting are Dragons of a New Age, the Bridges of Time series, and the Daemon trilogy. And out of those 11 books, 7 of them were written by Gene Rabe, and only 4 were written by other authors. I guess I'm not really counting the short story anthologies or that experimental reader's companion book. So, yeah, the Fifth Age, it was a very polarizing experiment, and I think that brings us to the next era, the Age of Mortals. Now, technically speaking, in Dragonlance lore, the Fifth Age and the Age of Mortals, they mean the same thing. For example, Chronicles takes place in the Fourth Age, or also known as the Age of Despair. Istar reigned during the Third Age, also known as the Age of Might. So each age can, be numbered, or it could have a more popular name. I prefer to use the number Fifth Age to refer to the previous era, and I like to use the Age of Mortals to refer to this new development era that begins in the year 2000 with the first book of the War of Souls trilogy. The year 2000 is also, coincidentally, the year that the last Fifth Age Saga game product was released for Dragonlance, and it was also the year that Dungeons & Dragons rules made the jump from 2nd edition to the 3rd edition. We'd also find out that Margaret Weis and Don Perrin form a company that later obtains the rights to make Dragonlance gaming products for the 3rd edition D&D game rules. And their first source book that they released was called Age of Mortals. So, I think it's safe to say that the year 2000 marks the end of the Fifth Age experiment with the release of the War of Souls trilogy. Let's take a look at that. In the year 2000, we get Dragons of a Fallen Sun. In 01, Dragons of a Lost Star. And in 02, Dragons of a Vanished Moon. All by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. We see Margaret and Tracy, they've come back to save Dragonlance. The War of Souls trilogy is absolutely a core storyline trilogy, and it accepts a lot of the experimental changes that happened in the Fifth Age, and then it also brings back many of the elements that people associate with Dragonlance, and in the process it heals a lot of the division and polarization that occurred from that Fifth Age experiment. And it also does it in a very interesting way, the way it describes sort of why and how those experimental changes occurred. As the trilogy ends, it leaves lots of open-ended storylines and unresolved potential for future development. There's not a lot of tying up everything into neat little bows. I think that this trilogy is exactly what Dragonlance needed at that time. If we look back at the Holy Six, the books of Chronicles and Legends, they were a great start to Dragonlance. But they kind of also inadvertently led to stagnation because nobody advanced the storyline past them until Dragons of Summer Flame came out almost a decade later. The War of Souls does not commit this mistake, and it's a great entry point to the Age of Mortals era. I personally consider this era of development to be Dragonlance's golden age. Let's take a look at a great series of companion books to this trilogy. And these are the Bertrem's Guides. In the year 2000, we get Bertrem's Guide to the Age of Mortals. In 01, Bertrem's Guide to the War of Souls, Volume 1. And in 02, Bertrem's Guide to the War of Souls, Volume 2. The Bertrem's Guides series is quite unusual. They're not quite anthologies of short stories per se. Bertrem works at the Great Library of Palanthas, and the first book is literally a guidebook that he has compiled. We have different authors writing entries on food, clothing, politics, festivals, and other cultural elements of the different peoples and places on the continent of Ancelon, and it's positively charming. The other books continue with this kind of framing device and consist of reports sent back to Bertrem that he compiles from other aesthetics or copies of journal entries or letters or excerpts from other documents. It's really well done, and it makes you feel like you're sitting in the great library itself, reading an actual guidebook to the world around you. This series, I think it makes a great companion to the War of Souls trilogy and provides a lot of background to the setting, but they're not necessarily traditional short stories. We do have a series of short story anthologies, and in 2001 we have The Search for Magic, the Tales from the War of Souls, and in 2003 we have The Players of Gillian, Tales from the World of Kryn, and in 2004 we have The Search for Power, Dragons from the War of Souls. So this is a more traditional series of short story anthologies, and there is kind of this pattern to their names of these books, but it's not quite consistent enough to easily use that pattern to name the series. So I just call it the Age of Mortals Anthologies series. The Search for Magic has many short stories about magic, and in the second book we get to see the return of the Players of Gillian. This is the magical troupe of traveling actors that were introduced in the story called the Traveling Players of Gillian that was first printed back in Best of Tales Volume 1 and was later reprinted again in Dragons in the Archives, the Best of Weis and Hickman. All the short stories in this book are connected with encounters with this troupe of actors. And then meanwhile, the stories in The Search for Power, Dragons from the War of Souls, all incorporate something draconic in them. All right, now let's take a look at some of the novels. First, we have the Crossroads series. This is a series of one-off books set in the years just before or during the War of Souls. Many of them feature locations that haven't seen a lot of previous attention. That's sort of the idea here. Locations that are a bit more out of the way. In the year 2000, we have The Clandestine Circle by Mary H. Herbert. And this is Mary's second Dragonlance novel and introduces Linsha, an undercover Solamnic knight in the City of Sanction, and one of my favorite characters. It is a lot of fun. Also in 2000, we have The Thieves' Guild by Jeff Crook. This is Jeff's second novel after The Rose and the Skull, and it's about the Thieves' Guild. It's set in Palanthas and how the Thieves' Guild rebuilds themselves. It kind of stands out a little bit in this series because Palanthas is not really out of the way. It's one of the more popular Dragonlance locations. In 2001, we have Dragon's Bluff by Mary H. Herbert, and this book concerns Ulin and Lucy, who were both characters in the short story The Raid on the Academy of High Sorcery in Rebels and Tyrants, and tells how they get drawn into intrigue in the city of Flotsam. In 2002, we have The Dragon Isles by Stephen D. Sullivan, and this is Stephen's only Dragonlance novel, though he does go on to write several more books in the young adults line. It is the first time we get to go to the magical and mysterious Dragon Isles, home to the metallic dragons. And then in 2003, we have The Middle of Nowhere with Paul B. Thompson. So here we have Paul returning as a solo author, giving us a story set in the middle of nowhere. It's essentially the Dragonlance version of The Seven Samurai, or The Magnificent Seven. Features a motley group of 7 mercenaries who are hired to defend this town from raiders. I think this series does a decent job of giving us some entertaining stories set in some more diverse locations. Next, we have the Age of Mortals series. This is a series of novels that are closely tied to the events in the War of Souls. Starts out in 2001 with Conundrum by Jeff Crook. This book focuses on the gnome Conundrum and the events before you meet him in the War of Souls. In 2002, we get The Lioness by Nancy Varian Berberick, and Nancy gives us a story set in Qualinesti, all about the elf Cariansere, who was first featured in The Puppet King and also in the War of Souls. This book is set several years before the War of Souls. In 2003, we have Dark Thane by Jeff Crook, and Jeff takes us into the dwarven kingdom of Thorbardin and chronicles the story of Tarn Bellogranite, directly following his role in the War of Souls trilogy. In 2004, we have The Prisoner of Haven by Nancy Varian Berberick, and Nancy tells the story of Usha and Desra and what happened to them while they were in the city of Haven during the War of Souls. And Also remember that Desra was previously featured in the novel Desra's Quest. Also in 04, we have the Wizards Conclave by Douglas Niles, and this book deals with how the Wizards of High Sorcery recover after the War of Souls and introduces an important new character, Corrin of Icereach, who appears in some other novels. In 04, we finish this up with The Lake of Death by Jean Rabe. This book serves as a sequel to her Daemon trilogy, and it builds on the dramatic changes that occurred at the end of the novel Redemption. I liked this series, and all the novels tie in pretty well to events and storylines around the War of Souls. Some occur before it, some during, and some afterwards. Individually, the books might not be essential reading, but taken together, this is exactly the kind of collaborative storytelling and weaving of different threads that epitomize what I really love about Dragonlance. Next, we have the Champions series. This starts out in 2006 with Saving Solace by Douglas W. Clark. This is Doug's first Dragonlance novel, and he will go on to write one more in this same series. And I really like his writing. Saving Solace reunites Palin and Gerard, and it's a lovely trip back to everyone's Dragonlance hometown, which is Solace. I love seeing how Doug treats the town and all the characters in it. This is a murder mystery novel, as we try to discover who killed the sheriff. Also in 06, we have The Alien Sea by Lucien Solben. We saw Lucien also wrote Renegade Wizards in the Anvil of Time series. And in this book, we have an adventure with the Sea Elves dealing with the World Gash. We get to meet Apoletta, who originally came from the Chronicles trilogy, and visit the underwater land of Watermere for the first time. I also want to note there is a short story, Song of the Mother, in the Dragons of Time anthology, and that's a prequel to this book. Next in 07, we have The Great White Worm by Peter Archer. This is Peter's sole Dragonlance novel, and it is a work very much inspired by Moby Dick. And in the introduction, Peter even describes how he's distantly related to Herman Melville, so expect to see a captain and crew fixated on hunting down a great white worm. And finally, in 07, we have Protecting Palanthas by Douglas W. Clark. So Doug comes back to give us basically a sequel to Saving Solace, and this time we see Gerard make his way to Palanthas, where he must make unexpected alliances to protect the city. This is another decent series. It's good to see Gerard get 2 novels after the War of Souls, and it's also good to get an underwater novel and then a Dragonlance interpretation of a classic story. So, not bad. All right, now let's take a look at the traditional trilogies that we have in the Age of Mortals era. We'll start out with the Minotaur Wars. In 03, we have Night of Blood. In 04, Tides of Blood. And in 05, Empire of Blood, all by Richard A. Knaak. So Richard is back with his Minotaurs. This trilogy builds directly on the storyline from the War of Souls and really fleshes out what the Minotaurs are doing. It also builds on Richard's continuing Minotaur storyline that started way back in The Legend of Huma, then to Kaz the Minotaur, then Land of the Minotaurs, all the way through Reavers of the Blood Sea. So read this trilogy if you want to find out what happens right after the War of Souls. Next, we have Dark Disciple. The Dark Disciple series here starts with Amber and Ashes in 04, and then in 06 we have Amber and Iron, and in 08, Amber and Blood. This is all by Margaret Weis, and she writes a trilogy focusing on the character of Mina. Now, Mina was left in an odd spot at the conclusion of the War of Souls, and this trilogy sets her off on a whole new character arc. So even if you didn't fall in love with her character in the War of Souls trilogy, I would still recommend picking up the Dark Disciple trilogy, as Mina changes quite a bit and the other characters are excellent. Next we have the Elven Exiles. In 05 we have Sanctuary, in 06 Alliances, and in 07 Destiny, all by Paul B. Thompson and Tonya C. Cook. Paul and Tonya return with another trilogy about the Elven nations and what happens to them in the aftermath of the War of Souls. I found this to be great reading and I highly recommend it. The next series is the Linsha trilogy. In 03, we have City of the Lost. In 04, Flight of the Fallen. And in 05, Return of the Exile, all by Mary H. Herbert. Mary's previous book, The Clandestine Circle, introduced us to the character of Linsha, and I really loved it, and I'm so happy that Linsha gets her own trilogy here. There's also a short story called The Eight in the Dragons of Time that accompanies this trilogy. The next series is the Ogre Titans trilogy. In 07, we have the Black Talon. In 08, the Fire Rose. And in 09, the Gargoyle King, all by Richard A. Knaak. Richard here is building on his previous Minotaur Wars trilogy, as well as the character of Golgrin, and so gives us a trilogy all about the ogres. Now, the ogres haven't gotten that much love in the past, but they're now a rising power, and this trilogy really fleshes them out and gives us a story all about them. Next, we have the Rise of Solamnia. In 05, Lord of the Rose. In 06, The Crown and the Sword. And in 07, The Measure and the Truth, all by Douglas Niles. Doug expands on the Knights of Solamnia after the War of Souls and describes how they bounce back and reorganize from recent events and, expand in power. And next we have the Stone Tellers trilogy. This is a trilogy about the founding of a goblin nation. In 07, we have The Rebellion. In 08, Death March. And in 09, Goblin Nation, all by Gene Rabe. Goblins have never really been developed as a race in Dragonlance. And Gene Rabe gives us a trilogy here that fleshes out their culture and history for the first time and gives them a place in the future story of Dragonlance. The next series is the Dwarf Home trilogy. In 07, we have The Secret of Pax Tharkis. 08, The Heir of Kaolin. And 2010, The Fate of Thorbardin, all by Douglas Niles. And here we see Doug really take ownership of the dwarves. He's taken over from Dan Parkinson. And Doug gives us a trilogy that charts the future of this race. For the final trilogy, we have something very special. The Taladas trilogy. This is a very unique trilogy that stands out from all of the other Dragonlance books, and it feels like a true gift that I never thought I'd see. In 2005, we have Blades of the Tiger. In 06, Trail of the Black Worm. And in 07, Shadow of the Flame, all by Chris Pierson. You see, all the other books that I've discussed, they take place back on the continent of Ansalon, but the world of Krynn is larger than a single continent. There are other lands. Way back in 1989, when Dragonlance was still pretty young, TSR produced a gaming product called Time of the Dragon, and it detailed an entirely new continent on Krynn, the continent of Taladas. There are elves and dwarves and gnomes and minotaurs and humans on Taladas, but they aren't quite the same as the ones on Ansalon. There are new nations, new cultures, and completely new histories. And yet, Taladas is still intimately connected to Dragonlance because it also felt the cataclysm and was shattered. It also endured the Chaos War and the War of Souls. All of these major world-shaking events that occurred on Ansalon, they also occurred on Taladas, but they occurred in a different context, and so they played out differently. For example, when the cataclysm shattered Taladas, it shattered it in a different way. And so visiting Taladas is kind of like looking at Dragonlance through the looking glass, where you have all the familiar themes and peoples and gods, and yet their shapes feel unfamiliar and fresh. This Taladas trilogy is basically the Chronicles trilogy for an entirely new continent of Krynn. So if you've read a lot of Dragonlance novels and find yourself wondering about lands across the distant seas, then go read these books. It really makes me so happy that this trilogy exists and that Chris Pierson did such a great job with it. All right. Well, those are all of the books in the Dragonlance series. Well, almost. There are some things that I kind of just want to mention that exist. So between 2003 and 2008, about 30 young adult books were published, including a young adult version of Chronicles and a bunch more trilogies. This was sort of in the midst of the Harry Potter craze. There were also roughly a dozen books, like the Practical Guide series and the Dragon Codex books, that were also aimed at younger readers. I don't quite include these in the main Dragonlance series. There were also some crossover novels with Ravenloft and Spelljammer, and there were those choose-your-own-adventure type books that I mentioned earlier, like the Soulforge. And there are also several larger reference books printed in like a letter size format or A4 format. These would include things like the Leaves from the Inn of the Last Home series. There's also art books and map books. And then, of course, there's the whole universe of gaming materials. We had, the first edition, second edition, and third edition D&D products, as well as the Saga game products, all of that. But for my map, I just wanted to focus on the mainline Dragonlance books. So at this point, I'd like to take another look at the map and see how we can use it. We can see the core storyline functions as sort of like a tree trunk connecting the different time periods together. If you start out reading the Holy Six, then after you've read those first 6 books, you've got some options. You can continue onwards with the core story into Second Generation and Summer Flame, or if you want more backstory on specific characters, then you have lots of prequel novels and have the Lost Chronicles. And if you're more interested in fleshing out the world and learning about side stories and histories of different races and places, then there are a lot of trilogies and one-off series available to you. I do recommend giving The Legend of Huma a read, and that might start you down the Kaz and the Minotaur storyline. Also, the Elven Nations and Dwarven Nations trilogies are both excellent, and they are great starting points for those respective storylines. And of course, there are also the classic era short story anthologies that can be a lot of fun and less of a commitment. Once you get through the Second Generation and Dragons of a Summer Flame, then you can continue moving forwards, or you could hit the Chaos War series and the Kang's Regiment series to see what else was going on at that time. The Kang's Regiment books are really great. Going forwards from there, we have a choice to make. The Fifth Age was very polarizing, and some people advise essentially skipping it and going straight to the War of Souls. And you can do that. But just note that there's a lot of stuff that happens in the world in the Fifth Age, and the War of Souls, it might seem a bit confusing if you skip it. If you do get into the Fifth Age books, then you could go right into the Dragons of a New Age trilogy, or you could even read the Bridges of Time series before that. Eventually, when you get to the War of Souls, then after that you have a lot of options again. All of the trilogies and one-off series in the Age of Mortals era here, they do a pretty good job of telling stories and building on the setting. Personally, I really liked the Lyncha books and the Dark Disciple trilogy, and a lot of the books in the Age of Mortals and Champions series. And then the trilogies are also really good, and they do a lot more of the heavy lifting with pushing the storyline forwards, focusing on specific races or institutions, and what happens next. I wanted to try and draw arrows on the map to show how the storylines connect across the books and series, but I found they got really messy really fast. So instead, I kind of just listed out a bunch of different storylines and the books in them separately. So if we take a look here we've got the main core storyline that sort of acts like that central trunk in the series. And then after that, I've broken out other storylines that are focusing on particular characters, or races or institutions in Dragonlance. And then finally on the bottom, I've put my purely subjective greatest hits collection of books and series that I thought were really good. I want to thank you for sticking with me for so long, and I do want to give kind of a quick epilogue right here. First, a quick recap on the eras. When I look at the classic era, I have a lot of nostalgia for that time period. It was great and formed the foundation of the series. It really focused on fleshing out the past with lots of background and history. But it also felt a bit stagnant because, everybody wanted to know what happens next for the setting, and it took a lot of years before we finally got to Dragons of Summer Flame. And then after that, we got this experimental Fifth Age coming in, trying lots of new things. It was a very exciting and ambitious time, but ultimately I'd say a failure. And then Tracy and Margaret returned to save the day with the War of Souls and kickstart this Age of Mortals era. Here we have the core story being very well supported with things like the Age of Mortals series and the Bertrem's guides. Lots of new trilogies came out telling the stories of the Minotaurs, the Elves, Dwarves, Ogres, Goblins, Solamnic Knights, and each one pushing the timeline forward while broadening and deepening the overall setting. We also saw lots of great novels set back in historic times like, the King Priest trilogy and the Urgoth trilogy. And there was even some really nice experimental stuff like the Talatis trilogy. I really feel this was the golden age of Dragonlance, and it felt like you had a lot of interesting and exciting storylines that were being woven together. I only have one real problem with the Age of Mortals era. It ended. In 2010, we saw the last new Dragonlance novel published, the final book of the Dwarfhome trilogy. And yeah, we got some collector's edition reprints of Chronicles and Legends in 2010 and 2011, but that last Dwarfhome book was really the last real new content coming out in 2010. And right now, as I'm recording this, it's May of 2021. So more than a decade has gone by without any new Dragonlance books. And these past 10 years have been pretty tough. There's really only been silence and, the expectation of future silence. It's pretty clear that Dragonlance had a good run, and unfortunately now it's dead. I've been calling this the era of silence. But then last year, something strange happened. Word broke that Margaret and Tracy were back again, and were writing a new Dragonlance trilogy. This was completely unexpected for me, and for the first time in more than a decade, I felt like there was hope that Dragonlance might be alive. There is now even hope of maybe 5th edition D&D gaming support for Dragonlance, and hope that maybe this new trilogy might kickstart a whole new Dragonlance development cycle. Now maybe it'll only be a single new trilogy and that's it. But maybe Dragonlance will rise again. And it was this twinkle of hope that inspired me to get back into Dragonlance and make all of this. I wanted to go back and remember everything, to outline the whole Dragonlance saga, and maybe even to remind some of the old fans of that old Dragonlance magic and help you identify books or storylines that you might have missed along the way. And then, for the next generation of readers of books yet unwritten, welcome. I hope you stay.